It's Andrew Cooper, Associate Director of CIGI in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Very pleased today to have Eric Helleiner with us. Eric is the CIGI Chair of International Governance and a Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Eric has just released a discussion paper on the G20 that is directed towards policymakers and the media for both the G8 coming up in Italy and for the G20 in Pittsburgh in September. Eric has co-authored this piece with Paola Subacchi from Chatham House, and we're very pleased to have Eric talk in some detail about the policy brief. Thank you. Some people say that the G20 is a crisis committee. Could you just sort of comment as an introductory comment on that, please?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the G20 came into being explicitly to deal with the financial crisis, and so you look at the first summit's agenda, and it's half of the text, if not much more than that, is on regulatory, very detailed regulatory issues. And so in that sense, its mandate has been so far much more narrow than the G8, which is talking about all kinds of different things. And so one of the questions we address in the paper is, in a sense, what is the division of labor between the G8 and the G20? And we try to argue that some of the things that the G8 can do is simply reinforce things that the G20 has now de facto taken over. So that many of the regulatory debates are now centered more in the G20. We have some recommendations about global imbalances, but in many ways those issues need to involve China. So China isn't in the G8, so that's not a terribly good forum for some of that. So the G8's role is a bit unclear, and one of the things we make some recommendations on is that the G8 can become a body which makes proposals which are then brought up in larger forum. And so a central one which we try to recommend in the paper has to do with IMF governance, where we suggest some of the key players are in fact in the G8 that could make some initial proposals for dealing with European representation, which is at the core of some of the difficulties around IMF governance. So on something like that, you can see the G8 does have a role, but even there, it's in a sense to initiate a dialogue, which then takes place in a larger forum.
So there's considerable momentum for the G20, both stylistically, I mean, and sort of nudging the G8, perhaps even sort of nudging it so it transforms itself, but also, of course, success on substantive issues.
Yeah, I mean, my own view is that the G20 has been a very useful forum in the crisis. I mean, you could not have achieved some of the things that have been achieved without a body of that kind. I mean, if we just do a counterfactual and imagine trying to deal with the crisis only in a G8 context, it just would have been ridiculous for a number of the issues that are involved. So in that sense, the G20, I mean, I see as extremely useful. And some of the issues are not just crisis management. So to go back to your first question, it's not simply a kind of a temporary body which deals with the immediacy of the crisis. They're dealing with long-term reform issues in which the key players in terms of power are represented. I mean, I have some misgivings about the fact that lower income countries are not well represented, and I think something needs to be done about that if the G20 is to be a longer term institution. But I think it would be wrong, in my view, to see the G20 as simply a temporary crisis management moment. It's already dealing with issues which extend 5-10 years into the future.
What do you think of leaders tackling these issues? I mean, they're obviously got a different political status than finance ministers, but at the same time, some of them have technical competence. Others are probably just seeing this as a bully pulpit, something that they can make more declaratory rather than the technical comments and analyses and deliverables.
Yeah, I have to admit I was a bit skeptical when I saw the initial focus of the November meeting on these very detailed issues, and I wondered how long can you keep the attention of leaders on bond rating agency regulation or derivatives regulation or things like that. And I have to say I've been impressed with the way that the leaders have been able to tell the technocrats who normally dominate these kinds of issues, to tell them, here's our priorities, here's certain deadlines you must follow, and often very tight deadlines. And that has given an enormous kind of urgency to what I think might have been a slower, more difficult process if it had been left at the non-leader, at the technocratic level. So in that sense, I think the G20, although I don't think the leaders have shifted the content of the regulatory debate so much, but they've given certain things priority, given certain things timetables, given it an urgency that I don't think it would have had otherwise.
And for people who don't spend time thinking and dealing with this every day, I mean, what are the 2 or 3 or 4 things that really jump out from the G20 that will sort of make a difference in people's lives?
Do you mean so far?
So far.
Yeah, so far.
Or of course anticipating Pittsburgh in terms of what might happen in September as well.
Well, when I look at the November Washington meeting and then the London meeting, the two things that stand out for me are, one, the enormous increase in funding for the IMF, which has been quite unprecedented in the scale, but also even the content using SDRs and very ambitious initiatives. Incidentally, just on that first point, I think the leaders may have put the cart before the horse, in the sense they gave the institution all this money before reforming its governance, and it's usually preferable to hold the money back, demanding change before, but that's been done now, and now we're dealing with the governance issues afterwards. So that's one key accomplishment, but with all those problems, I don't want to suggest that's entirely positive because of the governance issues being unresolved. The other one, which I think has been impressive, although much more needs to be done, is on the regulatory front, where we have now seen derivatives brought under a degree of public regulatory control, hedge funds brought under a degree of regulatory control, the whole agenda for what's called macro-prudential regulation, where you're not just trying to regulate each individual institution, but looking at the system-wide management of risk. That's been a very positive development. All of these things have been pushed by the G20 in a way that I think might have been difficult without that particular body. And it's not to say much more does not need to be done, because it does, but it's been an important body to set things in motion.
And as a catalyst for other sort of institutional change, you've mentioned the IMF, you've mentioned perhaps European representation. Are there other things that we could perhaps look forward to, that not just within the G20 ambit, but perhaps beyond and stretching from the various meetings?
Well, I mean, I deal with global financial issues, and the key thing that has happened alongside the IMF reform is the creation of a new body called the Financial Stability Board, which is enormously significant, bringing all the major players, major powers in the global financial realm into one room, giving this body some degree of authority to manage what is really a kind of an alphabet soup of organizations, dealing with securities, one with banking. That's been very positive, and I think we'll see the long-term implications of that over time.
Thanks, Eric.